I have a handout, although I won't be using any Persian, and I'll try to use as little Greek as I can. I thought you might like to be familiar with the names that I'll be referring to. It's an honor to be a part of this conference. It's also rather difficult to be asked to speak on Hesychasm at a conference where my own teacher, the one who opened my mind to the Hesychast experience, is present and speaks tonight. So I thought I would have to do something a little different to allow his territory to be more his. And I thought I would tell some stories, more contemporary stories. And I have to say that while I feel comfortable following the tone that was set this morning by Dr. Rossi and Dr. Chittick, I feel a little uncomfortable trying to fit these stories into kind of strict academic limits of either thought or even space. At least we're in a chapel, I guess. What I'll be talking about is succession, continuity, tradition, handing on that flame that Dr. Rossi mentioned. When we explore the ways of the heart in the classics of the Christian East, we must examine these in the context of a living tradition. Scholars, I think, may undermine the continuity of this tradition when they underline the influence only of certain individuals in the earlier or later medieval age. As we study particular writers or writings, we must remember that behind these there stands an entire and uninterrupted path of continuity. We do not do justice to authors such as Evagrius of Pontus in the 4th century, or John Climacus in the 7th, or Simeon the New Theologian in the 11th, or Gregory Palamas in the 14th, unless we study them in light of a cloud of witnesses, at once known and unknown, both men and women, early and medieval and modern alike. Alongside the more institutional, unbroken apostolic succession of the Christian Church, we must discern a parallel charismatic or spiritual succession that rejuvenates the Church through the centuries. In 10th century Constantinople, Simeon the New Theologian warned that to believe the ways of the heart are not a reality of the present is doctrinally and spiritually dangerous. I call heretics, he says, those who say that there is no one in our times and in our midst able to become like the fathers. Those who claim this is impossible have not fallen into one particular heresy, but rather into all of them. The same conviction is affirmed today by Abbot Vasilios on Mount Athos, or the Holy Mountain as it's known, a peninsula in northeastern Greece, and a key center of Orthodox monasticism, of Hesychasm, since the 10th century. His book, Hymn of Entry, an important book in my eyes, relates the contemporary monastic experience to 3rd and 4th century spirituality. And to convey the indisputable reality of his conclusion, he sketches the portrait of a monk who remains unnamed, yet whom Vasilios claims to know. Such monks, he says, unknown and anonymous, but full of light, exist. I know one. He literally overflows. That's an expression that gives some idea of the truth about him. Light shines from his being. And whether he speaks or whether he's silent, whether he sleeps or whether he's awake, whether he is present or whether he's absent, it is always the same thing that he says, the same thing that he is, the same grace, the same power. He is free, a man of the age to come. And for this reason, he alone speaks justly of this present age. In the presence of such a man, you understand the theology of St. Gregory Palamas. In his presence, you feel that the saints of old continue to live amongst us. Things present and things to come are made clear, not by discursive reasoning, but by being made manifest in life. So the presence of the saints of old becomes evident, and the grace of the saints of our own time transcends history, leading us here and now into eternity. I will return a little later to this account about the anonymous monk. Indeed, the Holy Mountain itself is a powerful symbol of this living continuity in the Christian East of an ancient tradition. To visit any of the 20 monastic communities, to journey to one of hundreds of cells inhabited by hermits, to learn even of the inconspicuous existence of those whose invisible life leaves no mark beyond a shadow of that ineffable divine light. It is to experience a way that has continued without interruption through the ages. The three figures portrayed in my paper all lived on Mount Athos. I was privileged to know the first and the third of these personally, and I knew the most intimate companion on the spiritual journey of the second. Each of them played a critical role in the revival of the monastic ideal during the 20th century, especially in Greece. Their spiritual heritage reaches far beyond the borders of the Holy Mountain and Greece or Russia, with a strong influence in Western Europe and North America. In order to provide an opportunity for conversation with these elders, I'll quote heavily from their words. They're representatives of the diversity of the heart's ways, alive today no less than in the past. And I think they complement one another. To give you one example, I won't be talking too much about the Jesus prayer or the prayer of the heart, but Sophrony, the first of these three, has a great deal to say about the Jesus prayer. And in the book that I quote from, His Life is Mine, he has a section, an appendix, that deals with an analysis of the Jesus prayer. Joseph the Hesychast, I would say, gave his entire life to the practice of the Jesus prayer. And Paisios hardly mentioned the Jesus prayer. Yet all that he did and said, I think, stemmed from the prayer of the heart. So they complement one another as well. Let me look at Sophrony of Essex first. Born Sergei Simeonovich in Tsarist Russia in 1896, Sophrony Sakharov sought to penetrate the mystical way of the heart through contemplation of the visible world. He studied fine arts in Moscow, where he developed a parallel interest in Buddhism and Indian culture. With the outbreak of World War I and the subsequent revolution in Russia, Sophrony meditated on the primary cause of suffering and the absolute source of truth, while yet retaining his keen awareness of the beauty of nature. Sophrony emigrated to Europe, traveling through Italy and Germany to France, where he exhibited his work in elite salons. He was soon to lose interest in matters intellectual and artistic, however. He remembered Christ's injunction, he says, to love God with all one's heart and with all one's mind, an insight that proved definitive for Sophrony, who enrolled in an Orthodox theological institute in Paris. He left those studies as well to make his way to Mount Athos, where monks, he felt, sought union with God. In 1930, Sophrony encountered starets Silouan, whom he acclaimed as the greatest gift from above. For 8 years, Sophrony enjoyed the spiritual direction of his elder, and on the death of the starets, Sophrony departed for the desert of the Holy Mountain. During World War II, Sophrony served as spiritual advisor to several communities on the Holy Mountain. Later he moved to a more remote region of the Athenite desert, where he inhabited a small chapel some 10 feet by 7 feet, hewn out of a rock face. And then he endured rigorous conditions, no fire, much dampness, for a life of reading and prayer. But after 3 winters, failing health obliged him to relinquish the cave and the mountain forever. He traveled once again to France, where in 1952 he published the life and teachings of his beloved starets Silouan in a book entitled The Undistorted Image. The accuracy of Silouan's story was confirmed by other ascetics on the mountain as being a genuine reflection of the spiritual way. This starets was canonized by the official church in 1988. In 1958, Sophrony founded a small community in Essex, England, where for years he served as its spiritual guide, faithful always to the legacy of his beloved starets. And it's in that community that he died and lays buried since 1993. Sophrony acknowledges his roots as lying in the tradition of Mount Athos. This great culture of the heart, he says, I met with on the Holy Mountain. Now in the scriptures, in the Christian scriptures, the term heart has an all-embracing sense. It signifies the spiritual center of the entire human person, the seat of emotion and reason. Well, for Sophrony, the human spirit hungers for knowledge, he writes, for entire, integral knowledge. The heart is opened wide to embrace a multitude of lives and eons of time. He refers to the human spirit. That indicates Sophrony's inconsistent use of terminology relating to the spiritual center of the human person, as well as to the divine source of grace. Among the terms, for instance, that he adopts to characterize the heart are spirit, with a small s, persona, soul, mind. Terms adopted to define the divinity include spirit, with capital S, divine breath, grace. Now, the inconsistency may be a deliberate emphasis on the diversity of the heart's ways and the intensity of the divine impact on the heart. Sophrony alludes to the never-ending growth of the soul. There is, he says, no end to this learning. He is part of a long line of authors who describe the inexhaustible nature of the knowledge of God. And while he desires to communicate the beauty of this experience, he confesses that it is impossible to keep silent, impossible to give voice. He is again within the succession of spiritual authors who underline the ineffable nature of the experience of God. The human heart is a mystery, indeed an enigma, Sophrony calls it, in the image of the divine mystery. And as the meeting point between God and the human person, the heart beholds divine light. God is revealed, says Sophrony, mainly through the heart as love and as light. This divine light is an existent reality, not an imaginary figment, not a figure of speech. Sophrony represents the mystics of light, a tradition dominant in the Christian East. There have been, he writes, not a few witnesses of this in the past, as there are in the present. Sophrony stands alongside Origen, Evagrius, the Desert Fathers, the homilies attributed to Macarius, Diadochus, John Climacus, a line continued right up to Simeon the New Theologian, and Gregory Palamas. Curiously, Sophrony is apprehensive about drawing parallels between the theology of light, as he sees it, and Eastern practices of illumination, such as, I quote, yoga or transcendental meditation and the like. I continue to quote, the practice of the Jesus prayer has been distorted into a so-called Christian yoga and mistaken for transcendental meditation. Close quote. Perhaps he distinguishes between Christian and non-Christian methods, first of all, to, I quote, stress the danger of such errors which look upon prayer, and the Jesus prayer in particular, as a simple, as an easy technical method leading to immediate unity with God. Or second, perhaps it's to emphasize that, I quote, outward similarities may differ vastly in inner content. Perhaps a mysticism of love should not lead to a relativism of truth, in his view. So it's to preserve the integrity of every religious culture that he avoids simplistic comparisons. The heart's illumination, that expresses an idea central with Sophrony. I quote, sometimes prayer consumes the heart like fire. When we become so conscious of our frailty that our spirit despairs, somehow, in an unknown fashion, a wondrous light appears. When the darkness within us is so appalling that we are paralyzed, the same light will transform black night into bright day. When we are overwhelmed by the feeling of our own utter nothingness, the uncreated light brings us like children into the Father's house. It's the notion that Dr. Nasser spoke so eloquently of last night, of the heart as a mirror where that nothingness of ours reflects the everything of God. The light is not natural. It's not a personal gift or an artistic talent. Sophrony is convinced that it is supernatural. This light, he says, is the light of divinity, hidden, mysterious by nature. And without an illumined heart, one is no longer human. Purity is the heart's natural condition, its fulfillment. Pride is the heart's unnatural state, its defilement. Sophrony identifies darkness with pride, illumination with humility. And the intellect is called to guard the heart against the sin of pride. So on the one hand, the heart's function is ascetical. It's a struggle to attain to spiritual liberty, which comes only, he says, after long years of ascetic striving. And on the other hand, the heart's function is liturgical. And liturgy is more than, I quote, simply a form of psychological or mental remembering. It's the preservation and continuation of knowledge through generations of priests. The point where the ascetical and the liturgical coincide lies in prayer, which is described as an infinite creation, a supreme art. Of all ascetic practices, he says, the striving for prayer is the most arduous. Two final points should be highlighted. First, while in Sophrony's writings there are no traces of any mysticism of darkness, there is great emphasis on the significance of suffering, on broken-heartedness, as the Psalms would say, on suffering of heart, as Mark the monk would say. For Sophrony, through suffering we penetrate the mysteries of being, and ultimately all suffering is contained and comprehended on the cross. He writes, this spiritual vision dissolves into contemplation of the crucified Christ. The way to this lies through the depths of hell. The hands of Christ crucified link the far ends of the abyss. This touch of divine love in the heart is our first contact with the heavenly side of the abyss. Even the physical heart feels the sensation of pain. I quote, this concentration within may take the form of a cramp, whereby heart, mind, and body are contracted together, like a tightly clenched fist. Prayer becomes a wordless cry, and regret for the distance separating us from God turns to acute grief. Although at the outset of the path, he says, now there is suffering and now rejoicing, at the final destination there is, he says, no more alternating between elation and depression, since all states are gathered into a single whole. Second, Sophrony believes that, I quote, when God by the Holy Spirit gives us understanding, our prayer assumes cosmic proportions. And although it's not always clear in his writings whether these proportions extend beyond humanity, or mankind as he calls it, the implication is that, I quote, the intrinsic quality of life is enhanced. Everything that happens assumes a different character. Darkness and death engulf all creation, ourselves first and foremost. So too does God's light and life. And quote, when you feel the touch of the eternal Spirit in your heart, love streams like a light on all creation. Though the physical heart feels this love, in kind it is spiritual, metaphysical. Yet only those who keep a clear conscience, not only before God, but toward their neighbor, towards animals, even towards material things, will care for all creation. Love embraces all created beings in joy over their salvation, and it is saddened by anyone's downfall. The divine Spirit draws the heart to compassion for all creation. Such is the path to the heart that was inspired in Sophrony by Starets Silouan, who taught him to stay his mind in hell and despair not. I close with a quote from Sophrony. We are naturally attracted to the all-highest, but our pilgrimage starts with our descent into the pit of hell. Then we are near the end of our long search for the depth of being. There's another side of that phrase that Dr. Rossi reminded us of in the patristic tradition, that in so far as. This is not a result of our effort, it's a result of grace. Or it's not just all of our effort, but it's beyond our effort, and in fact perhaps even in spite of our effort. Let's look at Joseph. Joseph the Hesychast, as he is known, was born in 1898 on the island of Paros in Greece. Orphaned as a young child, Joseph, called Francis, worked from a tender age to assist his family. At the age of 23, he decided to follow the monastic path on the Holy Mountain, and there he sought especially to learn the concepts of silence, hesychia, and attentiveness, nipsis. One day, he says, filled with tears, after wandering the Holy Mountain for years in search of a spiritual elder, he prayed to the Mother of God. And at last, I was completely changed, he writes, and forgot myself. I was filled with light in my heart and outside and everywhere, not being aware that I even had a body. The prayer, and he means the Jesus prayer, began to say itself within me, so rhythmically that I was amazed, since I myself was not making any effort. Joseph was enthusiastic about the inner way of the heart. He would pray for long hours of silence, sitting on a small wooden stool, keeping his mind in his heart. He fasted intensely, eating only 3 ounces of food near the time of sunset. And he kept extended vigil. He lived in a small cell, 6 feet by 5 feet, practicing no handiwork so as not to distract his concentration on prayer. His ascetic discipline included standing upright for long periods, even inflicting self-beatings. Joseph's austere and extreme self-denial did not prevent him from relating in humility, however, even in humor, to his disciples. He understood well that monastic perfection was to be found not in outward ascetic feats or rigorous deprivations, but in the inward life of charity, hidden in silence, cultivated in stillness. The inaudible prayer of the heart, he knew, was far louder than many more noticeable external acts of the outward man. At the cost of his silence, Joseph ultimately allowed a small number of disciples to gather around him and moved with them in 1951 to New Skete on Mount Athos. There, after falling ill on the eve of New Year's 1958 and following a painful few months, Joseph prepared for his death by fasting of everything except Holy Communion for 40 days, the last of his earthly life. On August 15th, 1959, on the feast of his beloved Mother of God, Joseph was seated in liturgy when he passed into the heavenly age. The biographer of Elder Joseph the Hesychast describes him as a legitimate continuator of the patristic tradition. Biography also underlines the dangerous fashion for self-appointed experts speaking about mental prayer, uncreated life, light, perfection, deification, and the like. The notion of tradition is regarded as a safeguard against this danger, and Joseph is for this reason continually referring to the Church Fathers. Joseph believed that, I quote, if such people as continue this tradition disappear, then the end of this world will come. And his disciple, another Joseph, believed that his elder was one such person. And he would often begin a section with the words, the elder used to tell us. For the Hesychast Joseph, the way of following the path of the heart, the way of the ascetics, is the way of obedience. There is no other road to salvation like this, he writes. Yet while obedience is a mystery, it's not magical. Joseph's teaching is quite radical. He says, as I've said to you before, the divine will with its transcendent character is not magically contained within positions or places or instruments. He is not recommending a slavish adherence to regulations or doctrines. Often Joseph would say, do as you think best. The ascetic discipline is closely related to spiritual discipling. Disobedience implies disorder. Obedience includes a regime of prayer and struggle, and that's why the elder insisted on a rule which actually looked more to the future kingdom than to the past tradition. The new creation, as he called it, was always his spiritual focus. Indeed, that's the context within which Joseph comprehends non-orthodox practices of prayer and contemplation. In an effort to dispel the concept of prayer as magic or illusion, Joseph is determined within his own community to treasure the wisdom that he's received from his own elders. Now, while reverence to tradition is important for Joseph, the rigor of ascetic struggle, the violence of ascetic struggle is the most striking aspect of his spiritual way. The right use of conceptual images, writes Joseph the Younger, the biographer, follows the right use of things. Or, otherwise put, the way that we regard our world is reflected in the way that we treat our world. And so the mysteries of unseen war, as Joseph would refer to them, are real. Joseph learned the almost indistinguishable details and trials, the changes and dispositions of the spiritual struggle. The main path, he writes, is the martyrdom of our conscience. And this was a struggle he undertook and understood personally. Since I first put on this monastic habit, I have not had my fill of bread or sleep. And he would never for anything exchange this experience. He writes, if you're going to lose grace and not know how to recall it, I prefer you not to find it, however harsh this may seem. This is why I wish you experience rather than grace. Experience brings many graces and recalls them if they hide themselves, but premature grace brings no experience. But the spiritual struggle is not a way of personal triumph or achievement. Rather, for Joseph, it's a way of sharing through suffering. The spiritual law of suffering is a reality whereby one assumes responsibility for affliction in the world. Exposure to temptations or trials, the Greek word is pyrasmi, engenders experience, the Greek word is pira, in bearing one another's burdens. Passion is ultimately a way to compassion. The aim is to endure patiently the spiritual warfare until the very wounds of the heart and the very weaknesses of the world are transformed. So the dogma of love, his words, transcends and exceeds the law of duty, his words. The ascetic reaches the point where, I quote, he neither blames nor condemns anyone for anything, not even Satan himself. And the opposite, or the enemy of love, is self-love, but in particular it's the vice of negligence caused by, he says, the complications of indifference. The cure for negligence, says Joseph, is remembrance of the kingdom. Bear in mind here that the Greek term for memory, mnemi, is etymologically related to the Greek term for lover, mystere. Remembrance is more than verbal, more than mental. Remembrance of the kingdom is another way of learning to love. Love is impossible without complete obedience, and prayer is impossible without true love. So the spiritual struggle is not an end in itself. Joseph says the battle against the passions is the beginning of the path to pure prayer. The work of prayer is superior to every virtue and commandment. Prayer of the heart always remained the chief preoccupation and chief goal of the elder. He too is vague and inconsistent about the terms he adopts to describe the heart, an inconsistency consistent with tradition. He speaks of heart, he speaks of soul, he speaks of character. And Joseph has more to say about the stages of the struggle to regain purity of heart than he has to say about the ideal condition of the heart or the results of that struggle. He feels more comfortable admitting the mysteries of the heart. His words, beyond speech, beyond substance, ungraspable, contained only to the extent that it extends the mind. Yet he understands the purpose of prayer as being love, a goal achievable by every person under any condition and within all circumstances. I close again with his words. When grace is operative in the soul of someone who is praying, then that person is flooded with the love of God so that he can no longer bear what he experiences. Afterwards, this love turns towards the world and man. And in general, he suffers with every grief and misery, even for the dumb animals, so that he weeps when he thinks that they are suffering. These are properties of love, but it is prayer that activates them and calls them forth. This is why those who are advanced in prayer do not cease to pray for the world. To them belongs even the continuation of life, however strange and audacious this may seem. Paisios. The elder Paisios was born in 1924 in Asia Minor, in a region traditionally renowned for its religious piety. And he was baptized by his village priest, Father Arsenios, man who died in 1924. He received Arsenios' name. Paisios' family fled as refugees to Greece, where Paisios completed his elementary education and his military service. In 1950, Paisios set out for Mount Athos, where he received his monastic tonsure. His favorite reading included the Desert Fathers and Abba Isaac the Syrian, whose mystic treatises he would keep beneath his pillow. He enjoyed visiting the well-known monastic figures of his time. In 1962, Paisios traveled to Mount Sinai. There he remained for 2 years in a cell opposite the Holy Mount of the Burning Bush and St. Catherine's Monastery. The Bedouins loved him. He used to carve wooden crosses and sell them to pilgrims in order to buy food for the natives. In 1964, he returned to the Holy Mountain, and his spiritual father during this period was a charismatic Russian elder named Tikhon, died in 1968. And on his death, Paisios moved into Tikhon's cell, his house. In 1968, Paisios encouraged one of his closest disciples, Vasilios, from whom we quoted at the outset of the paper, to serve as abbot in order to restore one of the monasteries on Mount Athos, Stavronikita, a crucial step for the recent renewal of monasticism on the Holy Mountain. Although Father Vasilios, arguably the most eloquent theological voice on Mount Athos today, is conspicuously absent from all published accounts of the life or teachings of Elder Paisios, I'm convinced that he was his most authentic disciple, and that his words quoted in my introduction refer anonymously to Paisios. In 1979, Paisios moved to a cell called Panaguda, or Little Virgin Mother, and from there he directed numerous people who sought advice through visitations or correspondence. I recall the small jar with paper and pencil outside his fence, where people would leave notes with problems, names for intercession, questions for counsel, even gifts for charity. Paisios became a magnet that attracted and transformed human suffering. He faced respiratory problems as early as 1966, and during one of his hospitalizations in Thessalonica, the elder became acquainted with the convent of St. John the Theologian at Suroti, just outside of Thessalonica. When in 1988 Paisios' health deteriorated, he was diagnosed with liver and lung cancer, it was the nuns of this convent who nursed him. He died on July 12, 1994, and he's buried in the same convent where in 1970 he had transferred the relics of his own elder, Father Arsenios of Cappadocia. Paisios too is part of a long spiritual tradition. Not only because of the holy man who baptized him, but also because of the holy mountain where he lived. But for him, tradition is more than a mere historical lineage. It implies an unbroken sacramental heritage. We are, he says, in no way inferior to the apostles who were physically close to Christ. We too have him inside our soul from a very young age, through the grace of holy baptism. He's one of very few ascetics of the contemporary, present, and even the classic past who refers to sacraments, and especially to baptism. Baptismal grace constitutes the source and goal of ascetic discipline for him. Self-purification aims at allowing space for divine grace. Ascesis looks to kenosis, self-emptying. The purpose of renunciation is, to quote his rather quaint images, to count down from 10 to 0 before sending off our missile into space. And he adds, like the Americans do. Perhaps the most apparent feature of Hesychas's life and teaching is his positive counsel. Be who you are, he almost always says to visitors. The advice he gives is, I quote, do not pretend. The heart as the source of authentic being here. Positive spirituality, I think, aptly describes his path to the heart. And in words reminiscent of Mark the monk in earlier centuries, he says, think positively. Try to develop positive thoughts. A single positive thought equals a vigil a whole night long on Mount Athos. He is at home with the ways of thoughts. I know from experience, he writes, that in this life people are divided into two categories. A third category does not exist. People either belong to one or another. The first resembles the fly. The main characteristic of the fly is that it is attracted to dirt. The other category is like the bee, whose main characteristic is always to look for something sweet. But his is not simply a spirituality of feeling good or self-help. Hesychast is careful to underline the importance of guidance in thoughts. You can turn the wheel of thoughts, he writes, but your spiritual guide will show you the direction. Indeed, Hesychast would further qualify his positive spirituality by adopting an apophatic attitude, insisting that the soul must be cleansed from positive thoughts as well. I quote, we must not have any thoughts in our mind and heart. Note again the same vagueness in terminology that we've seen in Sophrony and in Joseph. No thoughts in our mind or heart, whether positive ones or negative ones. This space inside us belongs to the grace of God. We must ignore both positive and negative thoughts and always confess them to our spiritual Father. Positive thinking reflects one aspect of Hesychas's teaching. Spiritual practicality reflects another. He is balanced. Even in matters of prayer, even in matters of strict discipline. He writes, everything must be done with discretion. We should not indiscreetly hold long services that make most of the monks fall asleep. During vigils, we should take into consideration both the younger monks, who are still weak, and the older ones. It's interesting that he says the older monks are the stronger ones, the younger ones are still weak. And among the practical matters that are broached by the elder are, to name some, taking medication. He says that pills will not solve the problem. They will temporarily cover the problem. Talks about problems of church hierarchy. He advises us to, I quote, mind our own humble thoughts. Talks about ecumenism. Talks about extraterrestrial creatures that people ask him about. He tells us not to worry about them. He answers questions about voting and taxes and questions relating to raising children. He says that children should be scolded in the morning so as to have the whole day to take their minds off the scolding. Talks about getting good grades at school, finding a spiritual father, obedience to spiritual elders, that's the inspirational authority, obedience to bishops. He also underlines institutional authority, though about obedience to bishops he says we should obey them with discretion. Talks about magic, doctors, even obstetricians, cursing, material things, owning them, abortion, disability, lying, business, mobile phones. He says they disturb the silence of the mountain. fear of war, the rule of prayer. He has a lot to say about patience. Live with patience, he says. There is no other way to get through life today. Be patient and do not take everything too seriously. Go to a large supermarket and buy yourself a good dose of apathy. Apathy, apathia in the Greek, of course, is not indifference. It's closer to acceptance in silence, acceptance in love. His practicality stems from his love. It stems from a sense of compassion and realism. Hesychast is anxious to stress personal responsibility in the struggle against passions, which are neither destroyed nor ignored, but restrained, redirected. He says, evil does not exist in the world. Everything was created by God and created good. Evil exists when we make wrong use of things God granted to us for our benefit. We must use everything in the right way, the natural way, and not abuse them or go against nature. So when one contains the passion, one regains a sense of compassion, which is none other for Hesychast than a vision of the world through God's eyes. He says, an expression of God's sympathy towards humanity, of God's providence for the whole world, of God's joy over the repentance even of the devil. The imagery he adopts is preciously quaint, reminiscent of the Desert Fathers. Divine justice, he says, is like a cork. No matter how hard you press it to the bottom of the sea, it will always come back to the surface. Put simply for Hesychast, God, his words, God tolerates everybody, so too should we. Hesychast was convinced that if people, I quote, applied to their lives the things they understand from scriptures, then there would be greater affinities between Christians and Muslims. Both religions, he says, seek to love God, to love neighbor, and need to learn to endure with patience. This lens of divine justice or divine sympathy leads Hesychast to feel close to the animals. While there may be many stories of visions in his life of the divine light, of the Lord, of the Virgin Mother, it is stories of his connection to animals that most color the life of the elder. This connection, the development of what he calls a different attitude inside the soul, comes less, I think, from a sense of abstract identity as it does from profound humility. Ultimately from a keen sense of listening. That's another function of the heart. Silences, Dr. Chittick made so abundantly clear, as the only fitting response to God's word. A heart listening humbly to God in heaven listens also to God in others and in everything. My mind, says Hesychast, tells me that even animals are better than I. So I humble myself before them and I obey them. Let me try and wrap up. The three elders referred to in my paper embrace a tradition they both deeply respect and genuinely reflect. But the manner in which they embody and succeed this very tradition differs greatly. One is an educated and artistic man, able to articulate the nuances of spiritual contemplation. Another is unlettered, an austere monk, willing to share with his disciples the fruits of his ascetic discipline. The third is a simple yet saintly elder who has touched and comforted numerous lives. The style and content, too, of the works that form the basis of my paper, while adhering to principles of the spiritual life and while reflecting the long heritage of classics on the prayer of the heart, reveal a breadth of insights and represent a variety of paths to the heart. Father Sophroni discerns and declares the fundamental truths of the kingdom in a profound and genuine way. He learned this way from Silouan the Starets, whose teaching he bequeathed to later generations. Joseph the Hesychast is interpreted by an elder, Joseph the Younger, who lived beside him for 12 years, who still lives on Mount Athos, who conveys and interprets the wisdom of his master in a personal and authentic way. And once again, we're exposed to this charismatic succession with a disciple recording and relating the way of his teacher. Finally, the elder Paisios reaches us through another Athonite monk who transmits the counsels of the elder to issues apparently, perhaps sometimes unfortunately, raised for the most part by himself rather than by the elder Paisios. But this Paisios is also the one who shared with our generation the holiness of Arsenios, recently canonized in the Orthodox Church. While in their solitude living apart from the world, each of these elders remained an integral part of the world, comprising the very heart of the world. It's not the great individual fast, not the personal ascetic feat, but the heart of what really matters that counted in their lives. They were pursuers of depth in detail. Sophrony took time to look you in the eyes. Joseph ignored his disability to pick up a lentil from the floor. And Paisios conversed with a lizard on his porch. Now, there were times, I admit, when I may have felt a certain discomfort in accepting the particular paths adopted or even advised by the elders. Sophrony notes, however, that the eternal truth transcends all scientific truths. In the spiritual sphere, writes Joseph, human rules of ordinary logic do not apply. The law of the Spirit constitutes the criterion and lenses through which we must examine the writings of these elders. Paisios warns that in order to communicate with those who have received this eternal knowledge, I quote, you need to be tuned into the same spiritual frequency. And he continues with the positive, non-judgmental counsel that's so characteristic of him. Do not try to use your logic. Sometimes I do not understand what I read. I only sense there is something good in it. But it seems it is not the right time for me to absorb this specific good, so I leave it aside. And Joseph, he too is encouraging. I paraphrase him. For those of us who have ears to hear and eyes to see, the grace which indwells in the words and experiences of these elders will not be hidden, but will make known to us that these are the fruit of many struggles and labors. They bear the seal of the full Hesychast tradition. Thank you.
Would you be willing to answer 2 questions? We have 15 minutes in which you could ask some questions.
Yes. Yes. First of all, there have been in the last couple of years some fairly good publications of sayings and even homilies by the elder Paisios, and I certainly warmly recommend them to you. In my expanded version, I refer to them. I need to be careful here. I'm not going to answer questions generally about the heart. You can ask Bishop Kaustos all those questions this evening, and he can answer them much better than I or anyone else. But in terms of Father Paisios, I can say fairly comfortably that he speaks a great deal about his own frailty, his own limitations. And that's the starting point, and certainly the starting point also of Joseph, Hesychast. And you remember Sophrony's words are going to the depths of hell. We often think of the heart as something to which we climb to in terms of reaching heights of our own effort or struggle that transcend our limitations. But from my encounters and my reading of Paisios, he will emphasize more the limitations of the heart and coming to know your weaknesses. That if the way of the heart is a way that transcends cultural or religious or doctrinal differences, it's not as an abstract sort of heart that you come to know that it transcends these, but as a reality that all human beings share, and that's the reality of brokenness. Hesychast was well aware of his own weakness, his own broken-heartedness, and that he saw as the connection between him and the rest of the world. That's why he could connect to the environment, that's why he could connect to every person that knocked on his door. So there's a sense in which we are like one another, less in the sort of high principles that we aspire to that might be similar in Sufism or in Christianity. Perhaps we're more like one another in the depths of our weaknesses and the reality of our humanity. Yes? Well, to put it in the context of the previous question as well, and what we've heard from the lives and teachings of these three, it's, again, if there's a realism about the writings, certainly of Joseph and Paisios, and this emphasis on weakness, on human limitation, on human frailty, that's not seen as a limitation by them. It's actually seen as our sins, our passions, our weaknesses, our temptations or whatever, are seen as a springboard, if you like, for reaching higher. So they're actually good things. They're not things to be, depressed about, but things to be grateful about. And so gratitude plays a major role. Gratitude for something that only someone else can give you. Another elder, it's not yours. Divine grace directly, again, it's not yours. If they are characterized by a sense of humor, it's because I think they've learned to take themselves less seriously and God more seriously. That truth or that light will come from outside, although it's the light that is within. Okay. Yes, one here and then.
I don't remember if it was Father Joseph or the book Monastic Wisdom, but one of those two speaks of temptation always comes before grace. Would you expound on that and speak how that is in the understanding of the Holy Constitution?
Trying to build on what we've said and not repeat, but temptation comes first. In a sense, in the elders that I've explored today, it's only temptation that comes. It's only temptation that we know. And the rest maybe comes from outside, from God. But it's almost not ours to deal with or talk about. Ours is to deal with the human weakness. And that's very much the line of the Desert Fathers, is it not? The line of Hesychast, who will say that you expect temptation until your last breath. And more than that, it's not just something negative, as I said, but something positive, something for which you're grateful. And Hesychast continues in the very next saying to add that without temptation no one is saved. So it's actually something for which we're grateful. Yes?
You describe Hesychast supporting it as a mystic of light. And as you know, historians often try to place mystics in categories of the apophatic and the apophatic, to
think he represents the mainline ascetic tradition. He was a monk himself, and he learned, the way of the heart through another monk who lived, an ascetic life on the Holy Mountain. So he is going to be speaking almost naturally, almost inevitably, of moving out of darkness, the darkness of sin, the darkness of ignorance, into light, the light of knowledge, the light of divine grace. That doesn't necessarily slot him into a category where he is purely cataphatic. In fact, quite the opposite. That light, connected to one of the questions asked earlier of Dr. Chittick and Dr. Rossi, is it's never-ending, and that growth in that knowledge is continual perfection. So you never know it all. You never know it exhaustively. So I would place him more in the apophatic tradition, though a mystic of light. Yes?
Joseph Hesychast, you mentioned that passion is ultimately a way to calm passion on the grace. Can you stand that?
No. Except to say that, again, when you know your limitations, you understand other people's limitations. Therefore you're understanding. Therefore you are compassionate. Therefore you cannot be judgmental. So knowing your own weaknesses is a way of knowing others as well, and not just staying within yourself. Silence is not disconnected from social connection. There's a beautiful section in Archbishop Anthony Bloom's writings on silence, where he tells us, and he writes so wonderfully of a silence that he has obviously experienced himself. He says that when you want to learn to be silent, when you want to learn to pray, you shut yourself off, you go into your room and you separate yourself from everyone else, and you come to a point where you say, I'm now by myself and I'm with God. It's just me and God, what Abba Alonius would say, in this world there's only I and God. And Anthony says that, Metropolitan Anthony says that after a short period of time, that will teach you already one very important thing, and that is that you probably will end up feeling bored with yourself. You'll probably end up feeling tired of what you're doing. And that, says Anthony, teaches us a very useful thing about relating to others. If after 10 minutes, he says, of spending time with yourself, you feel bored, what are others to say? I think, first of all, it might be important to remember that we're talking of a line that's not necessarily a biological line, or not only a biological continuity, though it's also that in the institutional church. I don't know that we'll get too many answers in the tradition. If we look to the church fathers, we'll get some insights. We'll read certain fathers, notably Simeon, who will speak of there being times in the institutional that lineage of authority where there is a kind of a breaking, an interruption, a kind of an intermittent kind of an energy. And there he says it's not that the the grace will continue after a certain period of time, but it's at that point where the other side of the coin, the inspirational side, if you like, more charismatic side, will almost complement what is lacking. And I don't know that even Simeon would say that you can do without one or the other. But there are times, I think, in the history of the church where one or another side is weaker. And that will mean that the other side will be stronger, sometimes to the detriment of the church, sometimes to the advantage of the church. The ideal is, I think, for both sides to complement one another, for that, for the Hesychasts in the desert to remind the church that, we aspire to the kingdom. This world is not the end of all, that we need to render unto Caesar things that are Caesar and to God the things that are God's. But the church also, the institutional church, has reminded through the centuries the Hesychasts and the monks that it's very easy for them to sort of be, to digress, to deviate into almost a sectarian movement. And the church has had to remind the monastics, who have been a pain for the church very often through the centuries, that it's where two or three are gathered in his name that Christ is. So somehow the two have to work together, and when there is what is apparently a break in that chain, the other side complements. Yes? Can I hear the question again? I'm sorry.
Yes. What is the meaning of the extreme asceticism often practiced by saints of the church, especially in light of this positive spirituality of the Christ?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it probably came out in the paper. I certainly feel more comfortable with Paisios's, way. But there is no one way. And there is no one struggle. Each of us is a different struggle, and faces a different struggle. So that we will find, as we will find in the traditional texts, certain among the ascetic writers who will speak in very harsh words about the ascetic struggle, and using words of violence against nature, and killing the body, or killing the passions. But you'll also find another thread in the same tradition that will speak about using every aspect of our life, even the negative ones, as energy that we can redirect, that we can transform. So you'll find both ends. And I think where you find the harsher language used, what I see, and this is being as sympathetic as I can to some of these difficult texts sometimes to interpret, I see the roughness, the aggression that's involved in a struggle against a nature that we all know that has developed over not just decades of our own life, but generations of our own family, and centuries of our own kind, that build up what Dr. Nasser spoke about yesterday, rust and crust, and it's hard to break through that. And what's involved is, in fact, violence. When John Climacus speaks about what a monk is, he says a monk is someone who does violence to his nature. And what he's talking about is the layers that he needs to sort of cut through. Otherwise, I try not to see too much of a distinction between the two ways. One is underlining, if you like, the way to that goal, and Paisios is I think, a good example of the result of that struggle.